Well, JP, we're in your library, and it's a beautiful library. You have a lot of great books in this library. I don't think the viewers can see, but you have books all around the room, but we have a lot in the background. So, a lot of what I do, I try to help young people, young adults succeed in life. And a lot of that means reading the right resources, gaining the right knowledge. We want to talk about building a library. We think that's very important for success in the modern world. So, can we talk about how to build a library and why building a library is important and how to think about going about that?
Yes. So, thank you for joining me in my library. This is my favorite room, and glad to have you here talking about these things. I think, to your point, knowledge is crucial, especially in this age. To begin with, as Aristotle says, and I have to agree, all men by nature desire to know. So, knowledge is fundamentally crucial for human flourishing. That's true of societal flourishing, it's no less true of individual flourishing. We need desperately, in order to live happy, successful lives, to be seeking after knowledge. But more than that, you're talking about success in this world in which we find ourselves, which is a very different world than the one in which Aristotle lived and thought and wrote. And our world is, we live in the age of information. The economy is a knowledge economy. Everything that is happening right now, the technological advances, the decisions that have to be made, all of the jobs that seem most sought after, the new things that are going to be happening tomorrow and next year that we haven't even yet thought, but we know are going to continue advancing more quickly than we can begin to keep up with. In this world, knowledge reigns. And so, as we think about how to set ourselves apart in this world, how to pursue success in this world, and to flourish in this world, we want to set ourselves apart with excellence. We want to be able to offer this world something that just not everyone can offer. And as we think about doing that, I think it's especially important to have a different sort of knowledge, a different sort of offering to a knowledge-based world than the average person living next door and around us. And that means while everyone else is scrolling, gaining this very time-sensitive, oftentimes helpful and urgent knowledge that comes from their social media feeds and instantaneous news outlets through their phones and computers and emails and everything else. This is a very urgent and fast-paced world. But as everyone else is gaining that sort of knowledge, and it would be irresponsible not to keep up with that to some degree, how much better if we are at that time drawing from the well of ages, by this point in human history, millennia, of some of the greatest thoughts ever thought that have been written down, vetted through the generations, so that we can draw upon that wisdom, so that we can actually bring to the table not only yesterday's news or even today's news, but we can bring to today and to tomorrow all of the wisdom of yesterday. And in doing so, not have to reinvent the wheel with each new news cycle, but get to stand on the shoulders of giants. That's how advances are made. That's how we get to set ourselves apart and really succeed. So I do think it's worth building a library, surrounding oneself with books, every bit as much as, or hopefully more than, our social media feeds, and in so doing, becoming a different sort of knowledgeable person than we tend to see in today's world.
So, what you're saying is, I wouldn't say common knowledge. When people think about becoming successful, they think about gaining technical knowledge or maybe becoming a lawyer or a doctor. And those are amazing professions, very good professions, and a lot of people are very successful in those professions, and we need those people. But you're talking about, it sounds like, building a library full of classic books, old books, books that are very academic, that can be difficult to understand. It seems like you're saying those are the kind of books that we need to be focusing on, that young people need to read and to study. And that's what a library should be made up of. So is that what you are thinking there and trying to communicate?
Yeah, well, I think it can be both and. I don't think we always have to choose. So in the best of libraries, you might have fun books on any range of very practical issues. You might have a book on anything from playing chess to learning the business of apiaries and beehives, keeping bees, and you might have a book on learning how to fly a plane or how to run circuit boards or any number of oddball practical interests. And maybe those aren't just hobby interests. Maybe you're going to make a business out of understanding more deeply how circuit boards work. That's practically useful in today's world. So you don't want to out practical knowledge from a library. I think that would be desperately unwise. But at the same time, what is the use of knowledge without wisdom? And as we seek wisdom in today's world, and not only wisdom per se, but a sort of knowledge that in and of itself is different than this fleeting, time-oriented knowledge that is so prevalent around us.
That has an expiration date.
That has, yes, an almost instantaneous expiration date, right? No sooner have you learned the current headline or the next new study, right, then another one comes and usurps its place. And not only in truth and validity, but perhaps in urgency too, right? So what we want to do is come alongside some of those practical books. And as far as those practical disciplines go, a book can in itself be more helpful than just a how-to article online. But when it comes to the more theoretical knowledge, we're talking about mastering, for instance, the art of human flourishing. I mean, not just how to perform a skill, but how to live a life worth living. And as soon as you enter into that sort of a question, you're entering into a question that you're not the first one to ask. At that point, you are entering into a question that has been shared and bounced back and forth through the greatest of works by the greatest of minds throughout the generations. And that one in particular, how is man meant to flourish, is ethics. And if you're going to delve into ethics and decide how you intend to live your life, something we all have to decide, and better to decide it intelligently than thoughtlessly. Before you decide how you're going to live your life, you have to have a metaphysics and an epistemology, for instance, on which to build that ethics. If you're going to do that thoughtfully, as a thoughtful person, especially with all of the various views that we're bombarded with constantly in today's world, you really have to put some thought into it. You really should read books. You really should stand on the shoulders of giants and seek to do it with some help rather than trying to pave a new way on your own.
Well, so I suppose someone could read Wikipedia. Wikipedia has a vast amount of information that includes some, not just politics, not just news information, but a lot of reviews on books and information that's important.
Yeah.
Why take the time to buy books and to stack them in a room? Takes a lot of space. They're hard to move.
Yeah.
Why not just read information online?
Yeah. We could spend the rest of our time listing reasons, not just to read information online, but a couple stand out to me. Firstly, you mentioned the vast information that's available on Wikipedia, for instance. And not only Wikipedia, but everything that Wikipedia stands for, the entire internet as a depository for vast amounts of information. But it is also a depository for vast amounts of misinformation. And that's not just some trite platitude there. I mean, what I'm getting at is a hugely significant change in the publication world, which is, until just these last few years, to publish something, you had to go through a process. And that process included editors and selectors and all sorts of people, peer reviewers at times, who helped to form a filter by which the consumer knew when they picked up a book or even an article in most cases that this was trustworthy, that this information had been vetted, that they could read it and take this to the bank. And we do not have that level of confidence in what's being published online now. There are still editors for some publications, although that's almost a dying breed, given the trajectory of the online publication model. So I think we have to keep in mind the danger of misinformation as we look at online sources. But another danger is, and this, I think we can just concede that point. Let's grant that there is a vast depository of information and good, relevant, worthwhile data online, which I want to grant. Like, I read online. Everyone ought to read online. What a wonderful, valuable opportunity we have in our age to access so much valuable information online. We should do that. But as we do, one other thing to keep in mind, aside from the danger of untruth and misinformation, is simply the fact that we tend to learn better reading an embodied text than a digital text online. And there are a number of things that go into that, but for most people, in the way that most people engage information and retain information, which is valuable. If you're going to put time into reading something, ideally you want to retain it and not just let it go in one ear and out the other, as it were. So if that's the case, there's plenty of evidence, experiential and scientific, to my knowledge, which shows that the average human being retains far more if there is a real book that is being held with a real page on which you can remember in your embodied mind, because we're not just souls. We live in bodies, and part of the human nature is the body. And so as we are embodied human creatures here, to read an embodied book with a real page that you have turned, perhaps even that you're marking up and including kinetic skills alongside, and then remembering, oh yes, I remember that quote or that piece of information, and I remember that it was at the top left-hand corner of such and such page. And then to be able to go and pull that book off the shelf because it's in your library. This is almost a hard drive, an external hard drive of my mind, right? I can go, and all I have to remember is where to go find it, where to search. Then I go pull it from here, and I have an embodied remembrance of where about to find that. I search, flip through the right-hand corners of those pages, and there it is. If the process of doing it in the first place didn't already sink it deeply enough into my mind, which frequently it does.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. So we've discussed, you've mentioned that books, good books, are worth someone's time investing in. They're worth reading for success, for flourishing, for living a meaningful life. And it's worth having a physical library, even though it's a lot to handle and it requires some investing in. So how does one go about thinking about building a library? There are just too many books, obviously, and one cannot even really read the best books, all of the best books. So how does one think about investing their limited resources of time and money into building a library that counts, that will help them flourish and succeed in life?
Right. Well, assuming we've come to the conclusion that it is, in fact, a worthwhile investment, that means different things for different people. It might mean for some people that you're sinking into this one book a month, and that may be plenty for your budget, and not only monetarily, but the time that you can invest in this and so on. For others, it might mean a great deal more than that. But we have to prioritize, because there is a principle of scarcity that for the largest of budgets, whether time or money or other resources, we have to reckon with scarcity. And any of us have to pick and choose. You're right. Even just the scarcity of time in life. We don't have time, as you said, to read all the books that we would like to read. So there alone, we have to prioritize and pick and choose and be intentional about how we do that. Someone might say, well, goodness, just pick up whatever's interesting to you and who cares, right? And you just go almost aimlessly through the process. I wouldn't think that's very wise. I think a much wiser approach would be, firstly, to rest on the wisdom of those who have come before us, to realize going into this, we're not the smartest people in the world. I'm not. I understand when I go to begin forming a library that there are greater minds than mine who already have developed opinions, not even singularly, but corporately throughout the history of Western civilization regarding what books are worth reading. So the best way for me to begin, then, is actually to begin aligning my library with the library of what those who are smarter than I am say the best books are. And that doesn't mean you go and you just buy all the best books. What it does mean is you take one of those best books, one of these books that are in the so-called canon, right, of great Western literature, and you start there and you see what you think of it. And maybe you like it, maybe you don't. If you don't, then you try another one, right? There's no use just trying to plod through something you're really not enjoying. You should find some enjoyment in what you're reading. Now, it should grow you. You should be stretching yourself and learning to find more mature levels of enjoyment that maybe you had not attained before. So it should stretch you, but you don't want to be miserable reading. There's no fun in that. Just put the book down. We shouldn't feel compelled to finish every book that we pick up. But you want to start with that Western canon. You want to ask those who are older and wiser, those who together throughout Western civilization have said, this book is worth reading. And then trust them and say, this book is probably worth my time reading. Then once you start there, I think the best way perhaps to move forward from that point on is simply to go with your interests. There's a lot to be said for following the Western canon. Part of being a good inheritor and a good steward of what we have received from our forebears in Western civilization is actually to take the knowledge that they have given to us, this deposit that they've entrusted to us, as it were, and to entrust that faithfully to the next generation as well, at least what's good in it. But more than that, what we want to do is develop our own interest. My library shouldn't be identical to your library. And as you walk around my shelves, you're going to see books, some of which you have too and you've read, and we have commonality there, and we can discuss those books in common. But then I have personalized interests because you and I are different people. And I'm going to buy books that I find interesting that maybe you don't. So on that note, my one piece of advice, I think the best advice that I could give, would simply be read what is interesting to you, and then use the footnotes. Think about what that author was reading. Maybe you're reading fiction literature and there are no footnotes. That's great. Well, if you like that author, just go back and find out, do a bit of a study about that author and see, okay, so C.S. Lewis wrote this book. It's fiction, there are no footnotes. Let me just go back and find, what did C.S. Lewis grow up reading? Or what was he reading at the time that he wrote that, right? So maybe I really enjoy The Great Divorce. There's not a footnote in The Great Divorce. But then I realized that The Great Divorce was almost entirely motivated by the fact that he was asked to write the introduction to Athanasius' On the Incarnation. And it was in reading On the Incarnation by Athanasius, who was an ancient church father from almost 2,000 years ago. And I think, well, if I enjoyed The Great Divorce, and I love C.S. Lewis, and Athanasius is what prompted C.S. Lewis to write The Great Divorce, maybe I'll get a copy of Athanasius and see if I like that too, right? Well, that's expanding my horizons then, and I get to go and experience and be introduced to different authors as well. If you're reading something that does have footnotes, then all the easier, right?
So
you find an
footnotes are
interesting
kind
claim.
of destiny, I guess, a little bit, kind of a joke. But...
Yeah, you could think of it that way, right? So if you're finding something interesting, you want to trace it out.
And
right?
that's not original to me. That was kind of a funny statement somebody made, but definitely someone who was a reader.
Okay.
So there's someone, he was an academic named Mortimer Adler. You know Mortimer Adler. He wrote a book called How to Read a Book. A very interesting book, very helpful book in terms of thinking through what books to read and how to read them.
Yes.
But he had this analogy. He talked about a pyramid of books. And he talked about how most books at the base of the pyramid, there's no way. I mean, all the books out there in the world, there are way too many to read, of course. But you start going up the pyramid, and books start getting more and more important, all the way to the pinnacle of the pyramid, to the very most important books. Is that the way you think about books? Do you think about books in terms of, most books are not worth reading, but there are a few books that probably everyone should at least think about reading,
yes.
and attempt to read,
yes.
For their own flourishing and success and achieving a good life, a happy life. Is that the way you think about it? Would you advise people to think that way? And if so, what are some of those books?
Yes. I can't say that I visualize it in a pyramid quite that way. But I think that what Adler is getting at in that pyramid analogy, I would agree with, and I do think in those terms. Some books are better than others. I certainly agree. Some books are just not worth our time reading. And that helps. When you realize you can't read everything, and when you realize that you don't even want to read most of everything, it helps to muddle through the otherwise overwhelming reality that you won't be able to, right? So that's worthwhile. But then among those books that are worth the reading, which ones are you going to prioritize, and on what basis? As Christians, we would place at the very pinnacle of that pyramid Scripture. And we would say that ought to be the bread and butter of our reading. That ought to be the most valuable literature to us. I mean, how can it be anything other? Under that, then, there still follows a hierarchy. And to some degree, that hierarchy is going to follow a simple equation of to what degree is such and such book in accordance with or harmonious with the teachings of Scripture, right? So there's lots of wonderful Christian literature that helps us better to understand and to apply and to garner an appreciation for and of the literature of Scripture that we should be prioritizing most highly. So there's going to be some great Christian literature, but once again, most of that great Christian literature at the very next to the top of the pyramid isn't going to have been published yesterday. It will have been published centuries ago. And we will be able to lean on the wisdom of our elder brothers and sisters in Christ in recognizing that this probably is a book that has already been used mightily by God to aid the church in coming to better appreciate His truth and His goodness and His beauty, and that there's a good chance that it will be used in our lives too, to be worthwhile. But we shouldn't only read Christian literature. There's also non-Christian literature. And there are a couple of different ways to think about that, but sometimes it's worth just reading literature that you know does not support or even harmonize with the Christian worldview. And that's okay, because there are other merits in reading that. Those merits can include sharpening our minds. Those merits can include exposing us to arguments that we might want to confront in apologetics and evangelism, and just being good friends and neighbors to those around us. It might also be that it helps to give us various categories and paradigms by which, although they didn't intend them this way because they would be non-Christian authors that we're talking about, that still they might offer paradigms and thought processes that help us to think through the Christian worldview more effectively. And you see that happen in the history of the church. I mean, our creeds and confessions regarding even what we believe about the Trinity, for instance, or the person and nature of Christ, those confessions trade in philosophical categories that were derived by pagan minds, which just goes to show there is truth.
Such as Socrates, or more exactly maybe Plato and Aristotle? Is that
Yes, especially both Plato and Aristotle. I mean, regarding differences between essences and substances and different natures, things along those lines.
So I think what you just said there, it's interesting and important, but most people are lost with that type of language. And most people, if they've heard of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they're not familiar with what they've written. It's hard to know where to start.
Yes.
And people have limited time. So how do you help someone who is maybe thinking about reading a little bit more and maybe wants to read important books that will help them? How do you help them start? Can you give them some practical information to build a library that's important and that matters for them, but I guess in easy steps and kind of where they should begin?
Yeah. So you certainly any of us want to be wading into deeper waters than we have yet experienced. What we don't want to do, any of us, should be to drown ourselves by jumping in the deep end too quickly. So it's easy to make a list, and everyone's list would be slightly different, some more different than others perhaps. It's easy to make a list of books that everyone ought to read. But that's very different than saying everyone ought to read this book right now. There are different seasons of life, different people undergo different different experiences, different stories throughout their lifetime, and what is really very edifying for one person in this time in life, maybe their neighbor just isn't ready for. Maybe it will be great for them 20 years from now. Or maybe it would have been really great for them while they were working through some question or difficulty in life 5 years ago. But maybe now's not the time. So I wouldn't just say, here's a list, now everyone should go and just read these 5, these 10, these 50 books as quickly as possible. What you do want to do is prioritize old books over new books for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, there's nothing new under the sun, so you're not going to find anything worth finding in a new book that you couldn't have found in an old book. And more than that, as you look at old books, the ones that are still available to us, the ones that you're going to readily find rather easily without searching in obscure corners of hard to find, used bookstores in some little town somewhere, those old books that are easily accessible to us are the ones that generation after generation after generation of wise, intelligent people have repeatedly agreed these are worth reading. So if you start with old books, then you have one added benefit that I've not yet mentioned, and I think might come as a real surprise to most people. C.S. Lewis, in fact, makes mention of this in his essay on the reading of old books, where he mentions that some people might think of reading Plato and have a mental block where they say to themselves, but Plato is the master. Plato is the great mind that the rest of all of philosophy has simply been footnotes to, right? And surely my little modern mind isn't ready, isn't equipped to just dive into Plato. So what I'll do instead is I'll go and I'll pick up a commentary on Plato. I'll pick up a book that was published last year or 10 years ago about Plato. Maybe it's an introductory book. Maybe it's a book that is intended by some very intelligent person that's a good author to actually introduce my mind to Plato.
So, for example, it could be that someone I know there's a book out there called From Plato to NATO. That's kind of it's not an original resource, a primary resource from Plato, but it's from someone who has probably thought, I haven't read the book, I know someone who has, but it's written by someone who has thought about Plato and how his thoughts have carried through history and affected history, modern history. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Yeah,
that's exactly the sort of book that I would be talking about, and that I think Lewis at least partly has in mind. And that might be a very valuable book, but Lewis's point, and I very much agree, is that we should not be intimidated by the greats themselves. We shouldn't give in to this assumption, this understandable but wrong assumption, that because Plato is the great, and whoever wrote From Plato to NATO is not a great philosopher whose mind is miles above mine, right? That I'll have an easier go of it reading this, and then that will equip me to actually go and read the original Plato. No, on the contrary, the very clarity and simplicity and accessibility of Plato is part of what made him great to begin with. So it doesn't take, in many, there are exceptions to this, but and this is truer of Plato than it is of Aristotle, perhaps. But it doesn't take an extremely well-educated or overly prepared mind. It doesn't take an introductory course or a guide to lead you through with the help of a commentary or another pop-lit book on this to approach Plato. If you want
pop literature.
Right, yeah, just popular literature that you go get at the bookstore to introduce you in a fun way to Plato, something along those lines. It doesn't take that. If you're interested in seeing what Plato had to say about something, pick up Plato.
Okay,
and so I think you'll be surprised.
But
right?
here is a probably if it's not said outwardly, it might be thought that I barely know who Plato is. Maybe some people do. But the thought that is often thought is that, it's not really practical for my situation.
Yeah.
I could read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is a modern book, and it's helped a lot of people succeed in the work world and in life. Why read Plato versus a newer book like the one I mentioned?
Yeah, well, you might say that Seven Habits of Highly Effective People has helped a lot of people succeed in life, but not nearly as many people as Plato has. Plato has helped a lot more people succeed in life, even indirectly, because Plato laid the intellectual foundations for the world in which we live, which is a world in which I think we're quite grateful to live. It's a world of Western civilization and all the fruit that it's brought us, and all that we are so thankful to be able to live in a modern Western civilized world as opposed to a darker world of centuries ago. I think that there's a great deal to be thankful for, and I think that it would be entirely ignorant and irresponsible to imagine, uh, even if understandable, to imagine that Plato was anything less than a real pillar on which this civilization was built, intellectually speaking. And yes, perhaps you can read some very bottom shelf book on Seven Habits, and maybe that's very worthwhile. I don't know this particular book. I'm not reading it, and I'm not knocking it. But what I am saying is, there are other very practical questions that sometimes we might make the mistake of thinking are impractical, such as what makes a life worth living. That sounds very high in the sky, philosophical, very armchair. Sit back, smoke a cigar, drink, your whiskey, and talk with your friends late into the night about this solution that you'll never actually find, right? Which is actually a great deal like what Plato writes about Socrates and his friends doing, right? Is they sit in a circle, they have that kind of an imaginary, philosophical, deep conversation, and sometimes they come to a solution, and sometimes they don't. And it's easy to think of something like what makes a life worth living, or what is the meaning of life, or how can I be a good person, right? Or what is reality, or how can we know, right? All of those seem like impossibly philosophical questions. And until you just step back and realize, yes, they are philosophical. There's no denying that. But how can you live without some sort of an answer to the question of how can I be a good person? If you don't have a working theory for how to be a good person, then good luck being a good person. If you don't have some sort of a working theory for how you can know something, you're going to go through life an utter skeptic.
Now, I do think that people have theories of how to be a good person, even without reading books.
Yes, that's
spending
right.
a lot of time in books.
I agree.
And I think there are a lot of ways people can gain that knowledge, and even to a certain extent successfully. I think people can listen to speakers. I think people can think through challenges. But you're saying that books will help you still more than not, or more than, but books can only add to your life, and it's worth the investment.
Some books can detract from one's life.
Okay.
Right.
Sure.
There are bad books. We would agree on that. But no, I think what I would just want to say there is that, firstly, assuming that you do have answers to these questions, because I mean, really, it's virtually impossible to live as a sentient human being and not have an answer to what's going to lead me to flourish and be a good person. How do I know, and what is real around me? Right. Those are three fundamental questions that you have to have a working theory of. But firstly, wherever you got that working theory, it's traced back to these ancient sources. If you are listening to a modern thinker give you answers to that, they themselves are probably better read than perhaps someone doubting this might be in the ancient sources. And if you yourself don't know the ancient sources, you're kind of at the mercy of that modern from which you're deriving your own principles.
You're kind of at the mercy of whatever information you come across.
That's right.
May not be helpful.
That's right.
I do want to ask you, you said there are some key questions. That might help people in terms of, if they had that framework in their minds, that might help people think about what they're reading better and maybe pick books that might help them more than if they didn't have those key questions in their head. What are those key questions, and where do they come from?
Yeah. In the historical conversation, there are many of these questions, but you can boil them down to three categories of questions, which I think I alluded to earlier in the three categories of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So metaphysics simply not being weird stuff about, magic or extra supernatural things. Metaphysics just being the question of what is reality. And then a whole host of questions that are subset questions of that, right? You have smaller questions that contribute to the answer that you come to. But you have to have some sort of an understanding of who you are, what kind of a being you are, what sort of a world it is that you live in, what exists, what doesn't exist. We all have a working theory of that. And we're far better off if it's an intelligent and well thought out working theory, one that we have read a bit into and can actually test against other working theories. Because my working theory may be slightly different than your working theory, and it is certainly quite different than an macroevolutionary materialist's working theory of what's real, right? As a Christian, I have a very different metaphysics than a scientific evolutionist does. And so insofar as that goes, you really should think intelligently and deliberately about what your metaphysics is. The second would be epistemology. How do we know? It's one thing to say what we believe is real, but as soon as you make a statement on that, you have to follow it with, yes, but how do you know? How do you properly derive knowledge regarding those things that you believe are real? Not only to believe that they are real to begin with, but then to go about studying, learning about what those things are and how to interact with those throughout life, right? How do you gain knowledge? How do you know? And that's epistemology. And once again, we have to have the sources that we trust. We have to know, do we believe that we come to knowledge based on just assuming things by a sort of natural intuition? Do we rationally reason towards certain conclusions? Do we have to experience something in order for it to become real to us or to become true, justified belief? What is that, right? We have to have some real theory for that, or else, as I said earlier, we just end up living as an utter skeptic, which is no way to live. Thirdly, then, ethics, which is the most familiar probably to most people. But the thing with ethics is that it rests upon one's metaphysics and epistemology. You can't have a consistent and thoughtful and therefore reliable ethical system if you don't first have a very clear picture of what your metaphysics is and what your epistemology is. And don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that everyone has to either be familiar with this language and read such and such book about it in order to be an intelligent person, or to be a successful person, or to be a happy person, right? I am saying that it helps. And it's very easy to be wrong about these things. And unless you want just to risk being wrong and just be hopeful and otherwise uninterested, which is not a very wise way to live, if you would actually like to take a bit of active interest in ensuring that you are correct about these things, then let's go to the masters and let's find out. Now, one more thing. That doesn't mean that we don't have modern books on our bookshelves. I'm not saying everyone needs to go out and buy Plato right now, and if you don't, you're being irresponsible. I think some people will happily and successfully live and die and not read Plato. That's okay. I'm not saying that everyone needs to. Nor am I saying that if you have anything more recent than Plato, you need to trash it and that shouldn't be included in your library. Much of what you see around us right now is much, much newer than Plato. And some of that, as someone who has read Plato and then who has read the secondary literature, much of that is going to be helpful in even deciding for myself what I think about Plato to begin with. And I'm just using Plato as one of countless examples in the ancient world. But in doing that, we should engage not only ancient interlocutors, ancient conversation partners, but also contemporary ones.
So you mentioned metaphysics, what is real. You mentioned epistemology, how do we know?
Yeah.
And then morality, what is good? What
ethics.
Ethics. Thank you. And number 4, I think, would be politics. We could add that as a category.
Some have, and so I wouldn't just immediately discount that. However, I think you're on much more solid ground if you categorize politics as a subset of ethics. If ethics is the art of human flourishing, then within that art comes, a smaller category, for instance, individual human flourishing, and then another subset of that would be societal flourishing. And the art of societal flourishing is politics.
Very good. So there was a gentleman I would read a lot from. Maybe some of the listeners have heard of him, Peter Drucker. He is a famous business writer. He invented the field of management science. He wrote, I think, 30, 40 books. Some very famous books he wrote on management and executive leadership are still read today. One of his biographers wrote a very interesting book about him, and he said when he went into his house, when Drucker was an older person, probably in his 80s or 90s, he was astonished when he looked at his library inside his house. He thought he would have all kinds of business books and management books on the shelves, but he said he had really all the books in his library were books on literature and philosophy and the great books. And so it just struck me that the one of the greatest business minds in American history, in world history, was a reader of the greatest books. And you can trace some of his business and management thinking to Plato. So I just found that very interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that if someone is a business person watching this video or wants to be successful in business, I think you can take Drucker as an example that one of the greatest business minds was not really a reader of business literature as we would think today, although he did study businesses.
Yeah.
I think his framework, his lens was from the greatest thinkers of all time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, that story, because while the author of this biography obviously was surprised at that, I would have been surprised at anything other. Simply because someone who made such a mark in one area must have had real significant influences from well without that area. And when you walk into someone's library, what you see is a very real representation of that man or woman's dialogue partners throughout their life. So it takes time to read. It's an investment of time alone, beyond other sorts of investments. And as you spend hours reading certain authors, you develop something of a real friendship with very many of them, and you become the sort of result of those hours dialoguing with those people. And so to walk into someone like Drucker's library and see who his dialogue partners have been, and to see that that the friends with whom he was spending so many countless hours over the decades were not other businessmen who all were in an echo chamber having the same little conversations about business over and over and over, and thus becoming more and more like each other, and thus coming up with no real good new ideas to push the industry forward, right? He instead says, okay, you can all go have business discussions. I'm going to go spend time hanging out and befriending and learning from dialogue partners well without the business world. And in doing that, I can re-enter into the business world as my own sphere, and I can bring in much, much new information, new knowledge, going back to where we began, right? I don't just bring in the same sort of knowledge that everyone around me already has, right? I'm bringing in the sort of knowledge that's gleaned from people who are very much unlike me, but who 1 hour at a time, page after page, I am becoming more like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Socrates makes a bigger splash in the modern business world than whoever is in the modern business world. So if you're hanging out with the modern business world, you're just going to be like the modern business world. Fine. If you're hanging out with Socrates in the evenings, and then you enter back into the modern business world, you're going to bring something new to the table.
Okay, so this has been very interesting, very helpful. I want to kind of bring it down just a little bit. And as we close, I just want to help someone who's, again, thinking about building a library for their own success and flourishing and life. You've brought up Socrates. I think we've brought up Plato and Aristotle a few times. Where should someone start? Just maybe talk about a few authors, maybe a few books that one should consider in terms of stretching themselves and becoming a better person, better thinker, and a more successful person.
Yeah. Without simply answering that question according to the Western canon. Just read the great books, right? It's difficult to give a very good answer without knowing the individual. What are their interests? What do they already know about? What are they hoping to do in life? That sort of thing. What's their current place in life? What season of life are they in? What sorts of intellectual questions are they interested in handling? So it's hard to say, but a few key contenders would be, we've already mentioned Plato and Aristotle. You should read Plato. If you're interested in this, you should read Plato. And it's a good idea, probably, if you are not already acquainted with Plato, to begin by reading his dialogues. Just pick up a book of the 5, early Platonic dialogues or something, and just start reading some dialogues. They're easy, short reads. They're enjoyable.
Fairly easy. They do require some concentration.
Oh, well, all the best reading does,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, who wants to sit down and have a good conversation without focus? If you and I as friends just sit down to have a good conversation, you don't want me to be distracted all the time. The conversation's not going to be worth having, right? It's the same thing reading. Don't read distractedly, right? Anything worth reading is going to be worth focusing on. So yes, it's not just a breeze that you don't want to focus on. That's very true. I would agree, but it's worth the focus, as anything is in life. So start with maybe Plato's dialogues. I have yet to find anyone who has actually read 1 or 2 or 3 and come away saying, didn't find it interesting, I think I'll quit. That's not the effect that Plato has on people, not open-minded people who have given him the chance. Aristotle is also key. We've mentioned him. If you've not read Aristotle, I think I would start with his Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics, I think, is the best intro to Aristotle. I know you've been reading the Ethics, and I'd be curious. I don't know. Would you say that's worth the read?
Oh, absolutely. A very interesting book, and I think the first chapter, the first book, the first part of Ethics is really important to pay attention to. I think he's trying to show people how to become happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
Eminently practical.
Yes. Yeah.
But then I would just say, because those are whether the dialogues or the ethics, you're talking about very didactic oriented, very inquisitive, intellectually absorbing books. There are also some other greats that are of quite a different nature, and those might include, for instance, the epics. So if you've not read Homer, read the Odyssey. Once again, I mean, anyone should read the Odyssey. If you try to read the Odyssey and you're not really enjoying it, it's a great book. It's worth enjoying, and I would say it's worth kind of developing a taste for that. It's a good thing worth acquiring a taste for. Start with the Odyssey over the Iliad, I would say.
So just in case these are new resources, the Odyssey takes place after the Iliad.
That's right.
And
That's right.
It's about Odysseus who's trying to get home from the Trojan War back to his family.
That's right. So it's a narrative rather than a conversation or a treatise on such and such intellectual topic, right?
And
you get to read a story. Yeah. That's right. And a beautiful one at that. You read the Odyssey, and I think you'll be a changed person. It changes the way you think, and it changes the way that you engage other thinkers who have read it, right? It becomes a common body of knowledge from which we all can draw upon as we have these great conversations and address these great questions together. So the Odyssey is big.
What about the Bible? I think the Bible scares some people, especially if they didn't grow up really reading the Bible. There were 66 books. It's a long book. It's kind of hard to know. Where to begin? Do I begin with Genesis? Do I begin somewhere in the New Testament? Help someone think about the Bible and if they should read it or not.
Yes, you should read the Bible. So I assumed that from the beginning, and perhaps I should have started by saying you should start with the Bible. And I do think, as you point out, people read the Bible, I think, on the whole, in a very interesting way to me, which is, and by the way, I think this is a great thing. I've done this many times, where you just take a year-long Bible reading plan and you say, I'm gonna read 2 or 3 or 4 chapters a day according to the plan, and at the end of the year I will have read the Bible, and if you do that, year by year on an annual basis. Several years later, you've read the Bible a number of times. It's never been more than a year since you have experienced any certain part of the Bible, and it's within your recollection. That's very valuable. But it is a book, and it's a book of books. And I think too rarely do we just sit down and read it as the book that it is. Maybe just sit down and read the Bible like you would read any other book. And just maybe that pays off greatly.
I think you've
This
read
is
the
the Word of
Bible
God.
in a month.
I started to.
No,
I got
impressive
about
time.
halfway through. Yes. And I plan to do that again, and I think in a different season of life, perhaps sooner than later. I think I'll be able to do that. About halfway through that attempt, a couple of pretty big life changes happened that I needed to address rather than continue on that, and I needed to be reading some other things concurrently. So, but yes, you can read the entire Bible in a month if you just are willing to spend between 2 and 3 hours a day reading. And that sounds crazy until you realize that the average American spends about 3 hours a day watching television.
Yeah, that would certainly be a wonderful investment, and I think very helpful. It's amazing how much of the day-to-day life that we experience in the West, in the United States, would be a lot different if it weren't for the Bible. And there's so much that I think can be gained by reading it as a story, because it really does have a unified message and theme. And
that's right. Absolutely. It's beautiful if you'll just sit and read it as something worth sitting and reading. Not a daily dose of medicine to take at the beginning of each day. There's value in that. I don't mean to disparage that at all. We should do that. We should have a daily dose of the Word of God. But let's not miss out on the opportunity to sit and just read the book of Genesis.
So let's transition real quick. We've talked about some of the great books, more of the philosophical works, and some of the epic poems, and we've talked about the Bible. Just real quick, what about literature, some fiction that's important to read? Why read fiction, and what would you suggest?
Yeah, fiction is important. I think it's very easy to assume in a conversation like this that you just want a lot of nonfiction kind of information download sort of books. Okay, let me just read this, mark what I want from it, glean that, put it back, and then keep moving on, right? Like it's some project. It is a project, but it's also a life. And there should be real joy in this. I think if the reading life is lived well, it ought to be a terribly happy life. It's wonderful. And you should be enjoying what you're reading, and you should be reading what you enjoy. And a lot of that, for most people, is literature. And I think, on the other hand, for people who have not yet learned how to enjoy literature, I think part of maturing as a person, which is something we all are ever trying to do, is just grow ourselves as people. If you don't already enjoy literature, you should learn to enjoy literature. Some literature is more accessible than other literature. Some is a difficult read, especially when you're reading foreign literature that's been translated into English. If you're not already a literature person, perhaps don't start by reading Tolstoy translated into English. However, one of my all-time favorite novels is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And it's not nearly the Leviathan of a read that Tolstoy frequently can be. Crime and Punishment isn't an enormous tome. It's a reasonable read, and it is brilliantly thought-provoking.
The description of the lead up to the crime is absolutely... you'll never forget it.
No, I think you won't. I think that's exactly right.
And so in terms of fiction, I think it's very interesting to think about fiction in terms of how one historian put it, that fictional works help us make sense of human experience. Mm-hmm. We can read reams and reams of data on what humans are like and how humans interact, but I think we can learn much more from reading a good book on fiction. Such as Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice. Mm-hmm. So this came from a historian, British historian. I just thought that was a very helpful way to think about literature and why it's important and useful.
Well, I think he's exactly right, and I think the Christian worldview just affirms that. in toto. I think that when you look at, we were just talking about reading the scripture. What are you reading on the whole as you read what God has given us in his word? You're reading a story. God has designed us in time to be narratively oriented creatures, by which I mean we love stories. We tell stories to ourselves. Our lives are individually stories which we day by day, moment by moment, are knitting together as in some way concurrently with God in divine providence, the author of our story. We get to choose to a very real degree the next chapter and the next bit of dialogue and so on and so forth. The decisions that are made that define our lives that we can look back on as hopefully a story that glorifies God and results in our everlasting happiness. And as we do that, I think what we see is, God in creating desires to communicate his goodness and love to us. As we attribute that motive to the Godhead at creation and in his ordination of and his organization of redemptive history in the story that he sought to tell. If what he wants to do is communicate his goodness and love toward us, he could have created us as purely mind or sentient beings, almost just floating souls, right, disembodied, which could have received something of a treatise written by God on the nature of love and his love for us. But that's not how he chose to reveal himself and his love to us. When he decided he wanted to reveal himself and his love to us, he chose instead to tell us a story that takes place over thousands of years, the climax of which occurs with his son dying for his bride on the cross. It's a story that we have been written into so that we can better understand what God wants to communicate to us. God himself understands on a far higher level, of course, than the historian to which you're referring, that absolutely, if we want to understand something deeply, let's put it in a narrative and not just in a treatise.
It's very good. Thank you for that, JP. I think that's a suitable place or a good place to conclude. Let's just end with this. The book of books, as you mentioned before, the Bible, helps someone understand or just think about how to begin reading the Bible. Would you suggest at the beginning or one particular book first?
Yeah, there is no one right way to answer this, and I think that many different people will give many different good answers. I would not counsel the average person simply to begin at the beginning. If you want to read the first 3 chapters of Genesis first, I think that would set you off in a very good direction. But if you want to start with one book of the Bible, I think my go-to for the average person not knowing a given individual's story and place in life, I would pretty quickly say the Gospel of John is the place to start. What I would want someone to do in approaching the Bible for the first time is behold Christ. And any of the 4 Gospels will do that with perfect clarity and efficacy. Perhaps the benefit to the Gospel of John over against the other 3, if you had to choose one to begin with, is simply that John is writing not only to a Greco-Roman world, so he's not writing in terribly Hebraic or Hebrew language, assuming that the audience is Hebrew and that he's using Hebrew terms and worldviews and such. He's writing to a world that is much more like our world today. So he's writing to an audience that is like us. And not only is he doing that, he is writing with real philosophical depth and thought-provoking inquisitiveness regarding the sorts of implications that Christ himself has on those very core questions that we've already returned to, which are the metaphysical questions, the epistemological questions, and the ethical questions. I think as you read thoughtfully through the book of John, you see that Christ composes the core of Christian metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And if that doesn't reshape your worldview, I don't know what will.
Thank you, JP. It's been a pleasure having this conversation. Very interesting conversation. I hope helpful. I think it is helpful. And I'm glad to be surrounded by your books and your library. I think I feel a little bit smarter after this conversation, and feels good being in a library.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.